I was making tea when they arrived. That is the detail I keep returning to. Even now, 3 years after the morning, the Varekh Dominion Tribute Vanguard dropped out of fold at the outer marker and pointed 44 warships at a planet that had not paid them tribute in 63,000 years. I was standing at the counter in my apartment on the 41st floor of the Accord Remembrance Tower, Caliph Shore District, with the kettle going and the window open to the pre-dawn salt air coming off the shelf sea. I was 62 years older than I am in my memory of that morning. I have been a civic records keeper most of my working life, 41 years cataloging the Accord's lower archive tiers, the administrative layers, the procedural filings, the treaty instruments that nobody reads because nobody needs to. 41 years of believing that the documents were the point, that the preparation was the purpose, that the long, patient, unglamorous work of building a record was itself the answer to every question the universe might someday ask. That morning, the universe asked its question. I heard it first through the residential alert tone, a low two-note sequence that the Accord broadcasts on the Civic channel when an event is underway that residents should know about but not fear. Not the emergency cascade, not the evacuation signal. The Civic tone, which means, something is happening, remain where you are, the Accord is handling it. I had heard that tone twice in my life before that morning, both times for navigational incidents in the outer approach corridor, both times resolved before I had finished reading the bulletin. I heard it, set down the kettle, and opened the window wider to look at the sky. The sky above Caliph Shore at that hour is a particular shade. Not yet dawn, not quite night, a blue so dark it is weight. The city below the tower is quiet in a way that daytime Caliph Shore never is. The transit rings in the mid-tier moving on slow overnight schedules, the harbor lights steady and low, the orbital ring overhead a faint line of blue-white fire tracing its path east to west across the upper atmosphere. I had watched that ring every morning for 22 years from this apartment. I knew exactly what it looked like at rest. At that moment, it did not look at rest. The platforms were not firing. Nothing was firing. But the Accord orbital defense ring, 22 platforms spaced in equatorial lock, each one a structure 3 kilometers long, each one carrying weapons arrays that could engage at distances I cannot make myself imagine in ordinary terms, had rotated to active posture. I could see the change the way you can see a muscle change when it tenses. No movement dramatic enough to catch, just a shift in the quality of stillness. The platforms had been oriented for standard scan duty. Now they were oriented for something else. I made my tea. I opened the Accord Civic broadcast on the room panel. The bulletin was already running. Fold emergence detected at outer marker 7, Varekh Dominion navigational signature. Formation count, 44 vessels. Broadcast channel, Accord Standard 9. Message type, Tribute demand. Accord response protocol active. Residents are advised to remain indoors and continue normal activity. No civilian action is required or recommended. I sat down with my tea and read that bulletin 4 times. Varekh Dominion. I knew that name. Every person in the Accord knew that name. The way you know the name of a thing you have been taught about since childhood without ever expecting to encounter it. The Varekh had been the dominant power in this region of the galaxy 63,000 years ago, a vast, tiered empire with 17 subject worlds, a tribute collection apparatus that spanned 4 stellar systems, and a particular habit of seeding underdeveloped planets with the expectation that those planets would develop into productive tributary colonies, and then in due time begin paying. Earth had been one of those planets, one of hundreds by most accounts. The Varekh had catalogued it, registered it, filed the appropriate colonial foundation instruments under their law, departed and not returned. 63,000 years had passed. The Varekh, it seemed, had finally found time to come back and collect. I am not, by training or temperament, a dramatic person. I have spent 4 decades in archive work, which selects heavily against drama. But I sat at my window with my tea cooling in my hands and felt the full weight of that moment press down through every floor of that tower, through every stratum of compressed time that the Accord had spent building the world outside my window, and I thought, they have no idea what they are about to read. Because I had helped build it, not the ships, not the orbital platforms, not the weapons arrays that were even then rotating to active posture in the sky above me. I had helped build the record. The Accord Counter-Tribute Archive, formally designated the Varekh Convention Counter-Record, Case Designation Caliph Prime, total volume 280 million pages, was the largest single legal instrument in the Accord's documented history. I had contributed 11 years of my career to its lower tiers, the procedural certification layers, the treaty instrument cross-references, the notarized chain of custody filings that established each document's authenticity under Varekh law specifically, because every page of that archive had been written to be legible and binding under the Dominion's own legal code. 63,000 years ago, Earth had been a tributary colony with no voice, no fleet, and no legal standing under Varekh Convention. 63,000 years of work had changed every one of those facts. The civic broadcast updated. I watched the text scroll. Accord Response Fleet Caliph Prime, 519 vessels, including 4 capital warships designated Accord's Unbroken Word, Accord's Long Charter, Accord's Patient Memory, and Accord's Enduring Answer, has assumed position in Kareth Deep Shadow Corridor. Fleet is at full active status. Accord Diplomatic Intercept Vessel Caliph Prime 1 is proceeding to outer marker for direct channel contact. 519 vessels. I closed my eyes for a moment. When I first came to the archive, a senior cataloger named Varekh Dominion had explained the project to me on my first morning of work. We were standing in the lower stack of Tier 14, surrounded by the physical backups. The Accord maintains physical backups of everything, because 63,000 years teaches you not to trust any single medium, and she had pulled one of the storage cylinders off the shelf and held it out to me. This cylinder holds about 400 pages, she said. We have 680,000 cylinders in this tier alone. This is not the biggest tier. She had not said it with pride. She had said it the way you state the dimensions of a wall you have been building for a long time, matter-of-factly, with the particular calm of someone who has accepted that the work is larger than any one person and will be completed by hands that come after. I asked her how long it had taken to build the archive to that point. She looked at the cylinder in her hands. 31,000 years, she said. We started the year the last Varekh ship left. We started the next generation after the departure, and we have not stopped since. That was 27 years before the morning I am describing. She told me, that first morning, about the founding generation, the group of legal scholars who had gathered in the years after the departure, when the Varekh had completed their registration survey and left without ceremony, and had looked at what the Dominion had done, and decided that the correct response was not to celebrate the departure, but to document it. Every aspect of it, every procedural deficiency in the registration, every requirement the Dominion had failed to fulfill, every clause of Varekh law that the departure had left in an indeterminate state. They had worked with almost nothing. The early Accord, not yet the Accord, not yet anything with that name or that authority, just a coalition of surviving city-states on a planet the Varekh had registered and ignored, had access to a fraction of Varekh legal documentation, enough to identify the shape of the problem, not enough to solve it. The founding generation had understood that the solution would require resources they did not have. Varekh legal texts, Varekh notarial certifications, scholars trained in Varekh law to the standard that Varekh courts would recognize. So they had done what the founding generation always does when the solution is beyond their lifetimes. They had written down what needed to be done, established the institutions that would pursue it, trained the next generation in the direction of the goal, and trusted. Varekh Dominion said it plainly. The founding generation could not build the archive. They didn't have the texts, they didn't have the trained scholars, they barely had the political stability to keep the institutions running. What they built was the intention. They wrote down exactly what the archive needed to be when it was finished, in enough detail that each subsequent generation could continue without needing to reinvent the purpose. And then they died, and their students continued, and those students continued. And for 31,000 years, every generation received the intention from the one before it and passed it to the one after. She paused and looked at the storage cylinders lining the shelves around us. She was 68 years old. She had spent 44 years in the archive. She would retire in 3 years, and she would never see the morning I am describing. None of them would, she said. Not one person who worked on this archive will be alive when it gets used. That's not a flaw in the design. That's the design. She put the cylinder back on the shelf and showed me to my workspace. I had added 11 years of my own work to those 31,000, and then retired to my apartment in Calais Shore and spent the subsequent years doing what retired civic records keepers do. Reading, walking the harbor tier, watching the orbital ring, making tea in the dark before dawn. On the morning the Varekh came back, I understood for the first time what all of it had been for. Not abstractly, I had always understood it abstractly, but in the body, in the bones, the way you understand something when it arrives. The broadcast updated again. Accord Diplomatic Intercept Vessel Calith Prime 1 has established direct channel contact with Varekh Dominion Tribute Vanguard. Accord Counter-Tribute Archive Transmission initiated at 3:12 local time. Transmission complete at 3:12 local time and 4.3 seconds. Total volume transmitted, 280,412,617 pages. Acknowledgement of receipt confirmed by Varekh Vanguard Command Channel at 3:12 local time and 19 seconds. 4.3 seconds. 280 million pages in 4.3 seconds. I had spent 11 years helping build a document that had just been transmitted in less time than it takes to draw a full breath. I stood up and went to the window. The sky had begun to lighten at the eastern edge, that first pale gray gold that comes before the actual color of dawn. The orbital ring was brighter than it had been. The platforms were at full active power, their running lights at maximum intensity, visible from the surface as a chain of hard blue-white points moving in their slow, enormous arc. Below the ring, at an altitude too high to see directly but visible on the broadcast overlay I had pulled up on my room panel, the Accord response fleet had cleared the Kareth deep shadow. 519 vessels. The overlay showed their formation as a distribution of light markers across the approach corridor above the southern hemisphere. I am not a naval person. I cannot read a fleet formation the way an officer would. What I could read was the scale. The Varekh Tribute Vanguard, by the overlay's count, occupied a compact formation at the outer marker, 44 vessels, which by any historical measure would have been an imposing force. The kind of display of power designed to make a tributary colony understand the weight of its obligation. Against the 519 vessels of the Accord response fleet, the 44 Varekh ships looked like something left over from an older and smaller world, which they were. I thought about what they were reading. I had worked on the lower tiers, the procedural foundations, but I knew the architecture of the whole. The Counter-Tribute Archive opened with a complete historical record of the Varekh Colonial Foundation, filing as it had been registered 63,000 years ago, reproduced in the original Varekh administrative script, certified under Varekh Notarial Convention by the Accord's Varekh Legal Authority. Because the Accord had trained and certified Varekh legal scholars for 40,000 years in preparation for exactly this moment. Then it proceeded, tier by tier, through 31 separate legal provisions, each one voiding the tribute obligation under a different clause of Varekh law itself. Provision 1. The Varekh Foundation Convention required a follow-up survey within 5,000 years of initial colonial registration to confirm developmental viability. No such survey had been conducted. Under Varekh administrative law, an unconfirmed registration lapsed after 10,000 years. The original registration was therefore void. Provision 2. Even if the registration were not void, the Varekh Tribute Convention required a direct treaty signature from the tributary world's governing authority before tribute obligations attached. Earth had signed no such treaty because no Varekh representative had been present to accept a signature. No signature, no treaty. No treaty, no obligation. The provisions continued through 31 variations of the same essential legal argument, that at every point at which Varekh law would have created a binding obligation, Varekh representatives had been absent. I knew provisions 7 through 14 personally. They were the provisions I had spent most of my 11 years cross-referencing, the section dealing with the Varekh's failure to file a developmental milestone assessment at the 50,000-year mark, which their own administrative code required for all active colonial registrations. The milestone assessment requirement was a narrow provision, easy to overlook, buried in a subsection of the Administrative Consolidation of Year 14,000 of the Dominion calendar. It had been identified by a legal scholar named Oren Varath Solon 600 years before I was born, and it had taken 4 generations of cross-reference work to fully document its implications across the relevant precedent cases. I had been the 4th of those generations. My specific contribution had been establishing the chain of citation, connecting the milestone assessment requirement to the 19 cases in Varekh administrative law, where a registration had been voided for failure to file. Cases pulled from Varekh legal records acquired through a contact world 3,000 light-years from here. Cases that had taken 40 years to acquire and 8 years to certify to accord standard. I had spent 11 years establishing, page by page, citation by citation, that the precedent was unambiguous. Varekh law had been applied consistently for 10,000 years to void registrations for this exact deficiency, which meant the Accord's invocation of it was not a novel interpretation. It was an application of settled Varekh precedent. The Varekh could not argue that the rule was unfair. They had written the rule, applied the rule, and built a legal tradition around the rule, and the archive was asking them to apply their own tradition to their own conduct. Provisions 7 through 14. My 11 years, one corner of one tier of a structure that had taken 63,000 years to build. The Dominion had seeded a world, registered a claim, and then left without doing any of the follow-up work its own law required. 63,000 years of absence had not preserved the claim. It had extinguished it, provision by provision, under instruments the Varekh themselves had written. The archive ended with a complete account of Earth's subsequent development, verified against Varekh developmental classification standards. The megacity networks, the orbital infrastructure, the Accord's membership in 7 interstellar conventions, and the Accord's legal standing as a sovereign power under the Theron Compact, which the Varekh Dominion had itself ratified 4,000 years before the colonial foundation of Earth. The Varekh had not simply lost their claim through absence. They had lost it through their own laws, their own conventions, their own ratified treaties. Every instrument that might have supported their tribute demand had been turned, carefully, and over the course of 31,000 years of legal scholarship, into the instrument of its own defeat. I thought about Vale Doran and her 680,000 storage cylinders. I thought about every name in the contributor register. The Accord maintained a full contributor register for the archive, 411,000 names spanning 63,000 years of work, generation after generation of legal scholars, archivists, translators, certifiers, notaries, and procedural specialists who had added their portion to the record and passed it to the hands that came after. My name was in that register. 11 years of cross-reference work in Tier 14, one name in 411,000. The broadcast updated. Varekh Dominion Tribute Vanguard has ceased broadcast on Tribute Demand Channel. Varekh Vanguard Command Channel active. Direct communication ongoing between Accord Diplomatic Intercept Vessel Caliph Prime 1 and Varekh Vanguard flag. Duration of communication ongoing. I made a second cup of tea. The sun came up over the eastern shelf in the way it does in late summer at this latitude, fast and almost violent, the gold coming up behind the sea horizon and filling the sky before the eye fully registers that it has moved. The Caliph Shore District caught the light from the east and held it in the glass faces of the towers, and for a few minutes everything in the district glowed with a color that has no good name in any language I know. Somewhere between copper and amber, warm and enormous, filling the sky from the orbital ring down to the harbor. The orbital ring was still at active posture. The 22 platforms caught the light too, each one a point of fire in the upper atmosphere, perfectly spaced, perfectly still. I had lived in this district for 22 years. I had watched the sun come up over the eastern shelf more mornings than I could count. But I watched it come up that morning with the specific awareness that it was falling on a city that had existed for 30,000 years, built on the foundation of a city before that, and one before that, all the way back to the first settlements on the Caliph Shelf, when the ocean levels had last shifted, and humans had begun to build on the reclaimed ground. The towers around me were not the original towers. Nothing in Caliph Shore was the original anything. But it was all continuous, generation to generation, watch to watch, shift to shift. The same patient, accumulating, deliberate work that had produced the archive I had spent 11 years of my life building, the fleet now holding position above the southern hemisphere, and the orbital ring currently staring down a Varekh Vanguard commander who had arrived expecting a tributary colony, and found something he did not have a category for. The civic broadcast updated. I read it standing at the window with my second cup of tea. Varekh Vanguard Command Channel transmission received. Accord translation complete. Message text. The Dominion acknowledges receipt of the Accord Counter-Tribute Archive. The Dominion disputes the legal interpretation of Provision 11 and requests clarification of the certification authority cited in Provision 22. The Dominion further states that the force of the original colonial registration derives from foundational Varekh imperial prerogative, which supersedes conventional legal instrument. The Dominion reaffirms the tribute demand under imperial prerogative authority and requests that the Accord comply. I set down my tea. Imperial prerogative. I knew that argument. Every Varekh legal scholar in the Accord knew that argument, because it was the last argument, the one the archive had been specifically written to close. Imperial prerogative was the Varekh's claim that their foundational authority as an empire superseded the procedural requirements of their own conventions, that they could, in effect, claim whatever they wished by virtue of being the Varekh Dominion, and no legal instrument could override that claim. It was not, in itself, an unreasonable argument under older galactic legal theory. It was the kind of argument that worked when the party making it had enough force to back it. The Accord's answer to imperial prerogative was Tier 31 of the Counter-Tribute Archive. Tier 31 was the section I had not worked on. It was the section the most senior Varekh legal scholars in the Accord had spent the last 8,000 years constructing. I knew its structure from the architecture documents, but I had never worked in it, because it required a level of Varekh legal certification that I did not hold. What it contained was a complete refutation of imperial prerogative as a valid legal concept under the Theron Compact, which, again, the Varekh had ratified, including a direct citation of the Varekh Dominion's own submission to the Compact at the time of ratification, in which the Dominion had explicitly agreed that Compact membership superseded imperial prerogative claims in all contested sovereignty matters. The Varekh had agreed, in writing, in their own legal script, under their own seal, that they could not use imperial prerogative to override compact member claims. Earth had been a compact member for 38,000 years. The broadcast updated. Accord Diplomatic Intercept Vessel Caliph Prime 1 has transmitted Tier 31 of the Counter-Tribute Archive to Varekh Vanguard Command Channel. Transmission volume, 47,300,000 pages. Transmission time, 0.9 seconds. Accord Response Fleet Caliph Prime has cleared Kareth Deep Shadow and is now visible to Varekh Vanguard sensor range. Accord Orbital Defense Ring confirmed at full active status on Varekh Vanguard sensor coverage. Accord has advised Varekh Vanguard that this completes the Accord's legal response to the tribute demand, and that no further legal communication is necessary. The fleet had cleared the shadow. I looked at the overlay on my room panel. The 519 vessels were now fully visible on the approach corridor display, not staged behind the asteroid shadow, not held in reserve but present. Declared. The Varekh could see all of them. 519 Accord warships, including 4 capital vessels each longer than the largest Varekh ship in the Vanguard, positioned across the southern approach corridor in a formation that communicated, with the particular clarity of mass and geometry, that the Accord had not assembled this fleet in response to the Varekh arrival. The Accord had assembled this fleet 19 years ago, when the Varekh fold signatures first appeared at the outer watch range, and had held it at Kareth Deep for 19 years, waiting for the moment the Vanguard crossed the outer marker. 19 years of a 500-vessel fleet holding position in an asteroid shadow. That was not a response, that was a prepared answer. I have been asked since that morning whether I felt fear. It is a question I have thought about carefully because I want to answer it honestly. The honest answer is, not exactly. What I felt, standing at that window watching the sun come fully up over the Caliph Shore towers, was something closer to the feeling I had on my last day in the archive before I retired, the feeling of having been part of something so large and so patient that the individual pieces of it, including yourself, cease to feel significant in the way individual things usually feel significant. You felt instead like a strand in something woven. The strand is not the cloth. But without the strands, there is no cloth. I was 62 years old that morning. My contribution to the archive had ended 11 years before. I had not been present for the legal work of Tier 31, or for the fleet assembly decision, or for the 19 years of holding position at Kareth Deep. I had been in this apartment, making tea and watching the orbital ring, which is the particular privilege of people who have done their portion of the work and retired to let the subsequent generations do theirs. But I had been part of it. My name was in the contributor register, Leva Dorn, Tier 14, Cross-Reference Authority, 11 years, one name in 411,000. And the 411,000 names, accumulated over 63,000 years, had produced the 280 million pages that had been transmitted in 4.3 seconds to a Varekh Vanguard commander who had crossed into the inner system expecting a tributary colony, and instead received, in less time than it takes to draw a breath, the complete legal record of everything his empire had done wrong. The broadcast updated. Varekh Vanguard Command Channel has gone silent. Duration of silence, 41 minutes. 41 minutes. I thought about the Vanguard commander on the other side of that silence. I tried to imagine what it would be like to read 280 million pages of your own empire's law, applied with surgical precision to the claim you had traveled however long it had taken them to get here to make. I could not fully imagine it. I am not, by nature, given to imagining the alien perspective. But I thought about the scale of the archive and the scale of the silence, and I thought, he is reading Tier 31. He is reading the document where his own empire agreed, in writing, that it could not do what he came here to do. I also thought about what it had taken to write that document. The Varekh's own legal texts had not been freely available. The founding generation had identified what they needed, but acquiring it had taken 8,000 years of diplomatic and intelligence work. The slow accumulation of Varekh legal documents through trade contacts, through scholar exchanges with worlds that had better access to the Dominion, through the meticulous reconstruction of legal texts from fragments and secondary citations. The Accord maintained a full acquisition register for the archive, separate from the contributor register. Every document source, every acquisition date, every scholar who had verified the authenticity of each piece of Varekh legal text before it was admitted to the working collection. The acquisition register was longer than the contributor register. It had taken more people, more years, more patience to gather the raw material than to build the argument from it. I had worked adjacent to the acquisition records in my time in Tier 14. I knew scholars who had spent entire careers, 30, 40 years, doing nothing but verifying the authenticity of individual Varekh legal documents against known standards, because a single uncertified document in the archive would have been a weakness, a crack that a skilled Varekh legal team could exploit to bring the whole structure into question. The verification work was meticulous and almost entirely invisible. It produced no visible product, generated no document of its own, appeared in the archive only as a certification stamp on the materials it validated. Decades of work, one stamp. I had asked one of those scholars once, early in my career, whether it felt futile, whether the prospect of spending a working life producing certifications that nobody would read, toward a legal filing that might never be used, against a return that might never happen, felt like a waste. She had considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. She said, "I don't think about it in terms of whether the Varekh come back. I think about it in terms of whether the next generation of scholars gets good material to work with. I can control that. I cannot control when or whether the Varekh return, so I certify the documents and I pass them to whoever comes after me." She retired 12 years before I did. Her name was in the contributor register. Her certifications were in the archive. Her work had been transmitted to a Varekh Vanguard commander 41 minutes ago along with 280 million other pages, all of which were now producing the silence I was listening to from my apartment window above the Caliph Shore district. I thought she would have appreciated knowing that. I thought she probably had known it, in the way she had always known it, not as a certainty about outcomes, but as a certainty about the work itself. The work was worth doing. The archive would be ready when it was needed. Both of those things had always been true regardless of whether the Varekh came back. The broadcast updated. Varekh Vanguard command channel active. Accord translation in progress. I waited. The sun had fully cleared the eastern shelf now, and Caliph Shore was in ordinary morning light, the copper amber gone, replaced by the clear, practical brightness of a working day. The transit rings below the tower had picked up to their daytime schedules. I could hear the harbor from the window. 2 tiers down, someone was playing music. The broadcast updated. Varekh Vanguard command transmission. Message text as follows. The Dominion has reviewed Tier 31 of the Counter-Tribute Archive. The Dominion does not dispute the authenticity of the Theron Compact submission documents. The Dominion requests confirmation that the Accord is invoking Theron Compact Article 44, Section 7, regarding contested sovereignty claims between Compact members. The Dominion further requests that the Accord state clearly whether it is prepared to file a formal Compact counterclaim against the Dominion's foundational colonial registration if the Vanguard does not withdraw. The Dominion requests this clarification before making a final decision regarding the tribute demand. I read that 3 times. He was asking whether we were serious, whether we would actually file, whether the archive was a negotiating position or a genuine legal instrument. The answer came 17 seconds later. Accord diplomatic intercept vessel Caliph Prime 1 transmission to Varekh Vanguard. Message text. The Accord confirms that it is invoking Theron Compact Article 44, Section 7. The Accord has maintained an active compact counterclaim filing against the Varekh Dominion's colonial registration for the past 38,000 years. Case designation Caliph Prime has been on file with the Theron Compact Registry under continuous active status since the Accord's ratification of the compact. The counterclaim is not a conditional instrument. It has been filed. It is current. The Accord advises the Varekh Dominion Tribute Vanguard that it is free to withdraw at any time under Theron Compact safe passage provision, and that the Accord will assign an escort formation to accompany the Vanguard to the outer marker as a courtesy. The Accord further advises that the safe passage offer will remain open for 48 hours from the time of this transmission, after which the Accord will consider the Vanguard's continued presence in Accord sovereign space a compact actionable event. The Accord wishes the Varekh Dominion a safe return. I let out a breath I had not fully registered holding. The counterclaim had been filed for 38,000 years. I had known that. It was in the procedural documentation I had worked with in Tier 14, but reading it stated in a direct transmission felt different than reading it in an archive document. The Accord had not assembled the counterclaim as a response to the Varekh arrival. The counterclaim had been filed the same generation the Accord ratified the Theron Compact, because the legal scholars of that generation had understood that the Dominion might someday return, and that the correct response to that possibility was not to wait for the return and then prepare, but to prepare the moment the tools were available and maintain the preparation continuously for as long as it took. 38,000 years of an active legal filing, not filed and forgotten, active, renewed and certified by each subsequent generation of Varekh legal scholars in the Accord, kept current, kept ready. I thought of Vale Doran again. I thought of the 411,000 names. I thought of the generation that had filed the first counterclaim before anyone alive could have known whether the Varekh would come back in 100 years or never, and had filed it anyway, and passed the obligation to maintain it to the next generation, and the next, all the way down to the generation that was currently staffing the diplomatic intercept vessel, and the response fleet, and the orbital ring platforms above my head. That generation was in their 20s and 30s. Some of them had been born after I retired from the archive. They were the current watch, and they were handling it without drama and without error, because they had been trained for it the way every generation before them had been trained for it. As the work of their time, the portion that fell to them, the next shift in a rotation that had not stopped for 63,000 years. The broadcast updated. Varekh Vanguard Command Channel active. Transmission incoming. I stood very still. Message text. The Dominion acknowledges the Accord statement. The Dominion will accept the safe passage escort to the outer marker. The Dominion withdraws the tribute demand under protest and reserves the right to pursue the matter through Theron Compact dispute resolution channels. The Dominion requests that the Accord transmit the formal case designation for the active counterclaim, so that the Dominion may register a formal response with the Compact Registry. The Dominion will begin withdrawal procedures upon receipt of confirmation. Under protest, I almost smiled. Under protest meant they were filing with the Theron Compact Registry, which meant the dispute would go to formal compact adjudication, which meant the Accord would be required to present the full countertribute archive in compact proceedings, which meant 280 million pages of Varekh law, applied by Varekh-certified legal scholars under Varekh Notarial Convention, would be formally entered into the permanent record of galactic jurisprudence under the most respected legal authority in this region of space. The Varekh, in attempting to protest, had handed the Accord the venue it would need to make the case permanent. I thought about whether the diplomat on the Caliph Prime one knew that. I thought about it for approximately 3 seconds before concluding that of course they knew. The Accord's Varekh legal authority had been anticipating this exact outcome for at least 20,000 years. The protest was not an unexpected development. The protest was, in all likelihood, an outcome the Accord had considered preferable to a clean withdrawal, because a clean withdrawal settled nothing, and a compact adjudication would settle everything. The broadcast updated. Accord has transmitted case designation Caliph Prime to Varekh Vanguard Command Channel. Escort formation Accord Caliph Response Wing, 12 vessels, is proceeding to Vanguard position. Varekh Tribute Vanguard has begun withdrawal maneuvers. Estimated time to outer marker, 9 hours, 14 minutes. 9 hours and 14 minutes. I turned off the room panel. I finished my tea. I stood at the window for a long time and watched the city below come fully awake, the transit rings moving at full daytime pace, the harbor traffic building, the morning shift in the manufacturing tier laying its faint vibration through the tower's foundations, the particular sound of 300,000 people in one district of one megacity of one planet going about the ordinary business of their day. Somewhere in the building, someone was cooking. Somewhere below me, the Caliph Shore Civic Garden was opening its eastern gates for the morning walkers. In the sky above all of it, the Accord orbital defense ring continued its slow arc from west to east. 22 platforms, each 3 kilometers long, each at full active status, watching 44 Varekh ships turn slowly toward the outer marker under escort. I have been asked what I felt in that moment standing at the window, whether it was triumph, whether it was relief, whether it was something I could put a name to. It was not triumph. Triumph is what you feel when something has been difficult and you have overcome the difficulty. This was not triumph, because the difficulty had not been the morning itself. The difficulty had been the 63,000 years before the morning. The difficulty had been the generation that started the archive without knowing if the Varekh would return in their lifetimes or ever, and started it anyway. The difficulty had been the 411,000 contributors, and the unbroken succession of legal scholars, and the 31 provisions built from Varekh law itself, and the 38,000 years of an active counterclaim filing. The difficulty had been all of that, and all of that had been finished before I was born. I had added 11 years to something that was already 30,000 years in the making. The generation on the Caliph Prime 1 and the Accord response fleet had added their portion to something that was already 60,000 years in the making. The morning was not the difficulty. The morning was the answer. What I felt was something I do not have a clean word for. It was the feeling of being a strand in a cloth that had just been tested. The cloth had held. The cloth would always have held, not because it was lucky, not because it was stronger than it expected to be, but because the people who had spent 63,000 years building it had understood that it needed to hold and had built it accordingly, and had trusted the generations after them to maintain it. And those generations had, every one of them, done exactly that. I thought about what that trust actually meant, in practice, at the scale of 63,000 years. It meant that the founding generation had trusted people they would never meet. It meant that each intermediate generation had trusted the generation before to have laid the correct foundation, and the generation after to carry the work forward faithfully. Trust at that scale is not sentimental. It has no room for sentiment. It is structural, the same as the trust you place in the engineering of a dam, or the integrity of a load-bearing wall, or the long-term stability of a legal instrument filed under a convention that may be invoked in circumstances you cannot predict. You build it correctly, and you maintain it correctly, and you trust that the maintenance will continue because the institution has been built around the maintenance. The trust is not in individual people. It is in the continuity of the work itself. I had understood this intellectually for 41 years. On that morning, watching the Varekh Vanguard's withdrawal maneuvers on the overlay, I understood it in the way you understand something that you have always known but have only just encountered in its full dimension. Every generation had received a world that the previous generation had left stronger. Not dramatically stronger, not transformed overnight, not improved by any single heroic act. Stronger in the way that a record grows stronger with each additional page, a legal argument grows stronger with each additional citation, a fleet grows stronger with each additional hull. Year by year, ship by ship, provision by provision, certification by certification, generation by generation. The Varekh Vanguard commander had arrived expecting a world 63,000 years behind his empire. He had found a world 63,000 years ahead of where he had last seen it, and every year of that difference had been deliberate. I thought about what the Varekh commander must have believed when he set out. He had believed he was returning to a world that owed him. He had believed that 63,000 years was a long absence, but that the obligation had survived the absence, that the tributary colony was still there in some form, diminished perhaps, changed certainly, but still subject to the original claim, because the original claim was the Dominion's, and the Dominion was the Dominion. He had not understood that 63,000 years of absence to us was not a gap in the record. It was the record. Every year of that absence was documented. Every legal implication of every year of that absence had been studied, catalogued, argued, certified, and filed. The Dominion's absence had not weakened our position. It had built our position, year by year, provision by provision, until the archive we had assembled from the raw material of their absence was the most complete legal refutation of a tribute claim in the history of compact jurisprudence. They had left us alone for 63,000 years. We had used every one of those years. That was the answer. That had always been going to be the answer. I thought about what the Vanguard commander was experiencing, 9 hours from the outer marker, in the company of 12 Accord escort vessels. I hoped, in the abstract way I sometimes hope for things I have no power over, that he was reading the archive rather than setting it aside. Not because his reading it would change the outcome. The outcome was already determined, had been determined the moment the counterclaim was filed 38,000 years ago, but because the archive deserved to be read. 411,000 names had contributed to it. The founding generation's intention had driven it. 63,000 years of disciplined, patient, unglamorous work had built it. The least the Dominion could do was read the document that had been written specifically for them. I closed the window. The morning air coming off the shelf sea had turned warm, the way it does in late summer when the sun clears the eastern ridge and the heat comes into the district. I put the kettle back on for a third cup of tea. On the overlay, I checked it one last time. The Varekh Vanguard was 9 hours and 12 minutes from the outer marker. 44 ships in a tight withdrawal formation, 12 Accord escorts maintaining their positions around the perimeter, the whole group moving at the deliberate pace of a force that had somewhere else to be, and had concluded there was nothing further to accomplish here. 9 hours and 12 minutes, and then they would be gone, and the counterclaim would proceed to Theron Compact adjudication, and the Accord's Varekh legal authority would spend the next several decades presenting 280 million pages of argument to a compact tribunal. And at the end of that process, the question of what Earth owed the Varekh Dominion would be settled not just for this generation, but for every generation after, under the permanent seal of the Compact Registry. My name was in the contributor register, one name in 411,000, 11 years in Tier 14, cross-reference authority, procedural certification. I thought about whether that was enough, whether a strand in a cloth was enough to be. The kettle came to boil. I poured the water and watched the steam rise in the morning light coming through the kitchen window, ordinary and bright. Below me, Caliph Shore was fully awake. The orbital ring had returned to scan posture, not rest exactly. The platforms were never exactly at rest, but the particular active combat posture had eased back to the steady, patient configuration I had watched every morning for 22 years. 3 years later, writing this from the same apartment, I can tell you that the Theron Compact adjudication is proceeding. The Accord's legal team presented the full archive in the first session. The Varekh Dominion's counterfiling ran to 11 million pages. The Compact Tribunal has not yet issued a ruling, and it may not for another decade. That is how these things work when they are done correctly. Slowly, carefully, with full respect for the weight of what is being decided. I think about the strand in the cloth. I think about Vale Doran and her storage cylinders. I think about the names in the contributor register that came before mine, the legal scholars who built Tier 31, the diplomats who filed the first compact counterclaim 38,000 years ago, the first generation that looked at the horizon after the last Varekh ship left and decided, without knowing if the ships would ever come back, to begin building the answer. They had trusted us. Every generation of them had trusted the generation after, all the way down to the crew of the Caliph Prime 1, and the pilots of the Accord Response Fleet, and the engineers running the orbital ring platforms, and the junior civic records keepers currently adding their 11 years to tier whatever comes after me. I think that trust was the thing. Not the archive alone, not the fleet, not the orbital ring. The trust that ran through all of it, the belief that the next watch would hold and the one after and the one after that, for as long as it took, for whatever it took, for 63,000 years if that was how long it needed to be. The next time I looked at the orbital ring that morning, it had returned fully to its ordinary posture, those 22 points of blue-white light tracing their slow arc across the morning sky, steady and patient and present. The same as every morning before, the same as every morning after. That is what it looks like when a people remembers.